Hello and welcome. This is Jen T. Grace, founder of Publisher Purpose, and I am sitting here with Don Berg for a book launch conversation. First and foremost, how are you doing, Don?
Doing great. Really glad to be here. Love to have the launch finally happening. We love that.
We all do, and I say this on literally every video I do that I love this day in particular because we have been working for a very long time in getting this done. And very long is obviously a relevant
Right.
relative, but it's exciting because we're here and now you can kind of bask in the successes of getting your book into the world. So your book is called Schooling for Holistic Equity. And so, yes, oh, she's so gorgeous. Oh, makes me so happy.
Yes.
And I love that you have the visual. So I want to just start, if you can just give a little overview of just kind of who you are and how you show up in the world.
Yeah. So my work is I'm positioning myself to be uh, a go-to for schools that want to really humanize their educational offering, to really be taking it to the next level in terms of not ignoring academic performance, but really putting a human experience into that academic experience, if that's what they're choosing to do. A number of the schools that I work with and have studied de-emphasize academics. They don't ignore it, but they de-emphasize it and try to make sure that there's more going on. So I'm trying to kind of bridge the worlds of these schools that do something a little different with the schools that are more mainstream. So I'm figuring out how to do that. I've got some projects in the works to create tools to help them move that forward. So that's my main focus.
Yeah, that's so good. And so then what led you to kind of the realization that putting this into the form of a book could, have a bigger impact? Like what was the catalyst?
Yeah. So actually, this is my, I think, seventh book. And so I've been trying to work on this, like get this word out. And I seem to be a little weird in the world, because when you read the books on a variety of things, how to create the, they think, oh, just do this and then iterate, and it's like, well, if you're starting with the small and then going to the big, that works great. But that doesn't seem to be how my brain works. My brain seems to go like, okay, you have to encompass the whole world, and then you can figure out what the details are. And so the reason I've written so many books is because I keep trying it and going, oh, that didn't quite. The first one was terrible. And I took a number of years before I wrote another one, and I just did my own self-published kind of thing each time. And then I realized, like, you know what, I need to up my game and really step up to putting it together into a piece that really expresses that bigger picture. So that's where this one came in. Is it actually is several books that I've already written, kind of woven together and put into a real coherent argument for this big picture change that can happen in schools. What my partner says, it's humanizing education. But to me, my training is in psychology, and that's where I really found, like, oh, okay, that's where I could really grasp what's going on in this with these kids. Because I started out as a practitioner, not an author and stuff like that. I started out, actually, it was a micro school before micro schools were a thing. They're big now, but they weren't then. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I homeschooled other people's kids, essentially, and had some really good successes with that. And was like, wow, okay. But then didn't work out a sustainable business model, and life went on. But then that's always been there. That's always been a, like, okay, why did that work? What's going on? And why are the schools that I appreciate so much so marginal to the industry, so marginal to this big important part of how our society works, and yet they're very much at the margins of it. And so I was like, okay, that's a piece I can that my passion is there. So I've been pursuing it for, I could easily say this took 10 years.
Yeah.
10 years, but it took many forms before it actually came out in this form.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the the why of it is really, like, I had to figure that out, and I put this together to really express it in one place, and move that conversation forward.
Yeah. I love this, and I'm trying to figure out the order of the question to ask you because I have a couple of them in my mind, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure which is going to be the easiest. But I'm curious. So when you held your book up,
Hmm.
your book, it's gorgeous and it's comprehensive. I think
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
the best way to describe it. Like
It's a
it's
thick book.
yeah, it's a big one, which just shows how much information kind of goes into this. So I'm curious, kind of first, who is this book written for? Like, who
Mhm,
really is
mhm.
that ideal person that's going to pick this up, or maybe buy it and pass it along to somebody else that they know? What is that
Right.
person?
So the first person is somebody who's early in their training, maybe a teacher training, maybe a principal training, somebody who's in that space where they need to reconsider what it all means.
Hmm.
Which is why when you're in your teacher certification program, they have like those. They used to call them philosophy education courses. Now they do it, kind of roll that into methodologies or other kinds of courses where they say, okay, um, let's dig deep, get down to the fundaments, and say, okay, this is what's it's all about. And so that's the ideal audience. And of course, somebody who is in that moment where they're at a deflection point in their career and they're saying, okay, what is this about? And they're doing the same kind of conversation with themselves and saying, okay, how do I rethink this? Or someone who may be disillusioned. I mean, once again, deflection point is like, maybe they're considering what does it look like in those other kinds of schools, schools that don't operate in the mainstream. What do these other schools look like? And so that's a part of why it takes so many words, is because it's just explaining something that people don't naturally understand, because most people didn't go through the kind of education that I focus on.
Yeah.
And I'm comparing both because I grew up in the mainstream of education. That's where my schooling was, all traditional public kind of schooling. I did go to magnet programs a couple times, but
Mhm.
it was very much mainstream, regular schooling. Um, and then as an adult, when I realized a passion for working with kids, it was like, I can't do that. Yeah, that was like utterly obvious. Like that didn't, even though I was successful. I mean, I went to an elite college. I did good work in the traditional sphere, but I realized like it really truly didn't serve me as a human being. It didn't really serve um, my my spirit, my who I am as a person, and I didn't know why. In fact, one of the stories I tell in the book is that one of my first interviews with a journalist, the first question was, "Why are you so angry?" I was like, "What? Angry?"
Mm,
I Because my writing at that time came across as just
mm,
pissed off
mm.
about the whole thing. Upon reflection, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that's really kind of true.
Yeah.
And so part of what the journey has been in the writing has been, um, let go of the anger, but keep the passion. You
Yeah.
know, Passion underlies it, and there's such a challenge in looking at this system. I mean, my goal, and someone asked me this recently, um, and said, I remember what it was. Who do you want equity for?
Mm,
And this was somebody who probably had a conservative bent and was concerned that I was, focusing on only some people.
mhm,
But truly, it is for the children,
mhm,
regardless of anything about them.
mhm,
It is children that I'm committed to bringing equity to. And the research that I did was built on decades of observation in many kinds of schools, but mostly the mainstream, and showed, oh, kids are disengaged at a very high rate. No, this isn't news. Everybody knew this. If
yeah.
when you go to school and everybody expects you to be bored
Yep.
and disengaged
Or
and like only do as much as you can to get by,
yeah.
and that's normal. That's what's expected. Then in educational terms, something's very, very wrong.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, when they ask, who are you doing this for? It's for the children, and it's really bringing equity. I wanted the experience I had, which, like I said, I was successful on the system's terms
Mhm.
because I got into an elite college. Isn't that the whole goal? You go through K-12, you get into an elite college, you won, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I did that in such a way that in after 3 years in my first time in college, it was like I was burned out. I'd been burned out for a long time, but then I suddenly realized it, and I dropped out. So I went to college and dropped out because it had burned me out first.
Yeah.
And that's ridiculous. Now I went back and finished
Yeah.
20 years later. Had a 20-year sabbatical in the middle. But that was part of what drove me to figure these things out. Is like, wait a minute, why was I more engaged and passionate and interested in better grades and the whole bit the second time around? That's,
Yeah.
what's going on? Why was I more engaged the first time? And so there's actually, I think, some really important things to learn from psychology about engagement and motivation and how it works. And even if the education magazine, EL magazine is one I get a lot
Mm.
from ASCD, and they had a whole issue on it, and they're not even 10 years behind. They're like more than 10 years behind in terms of what psychology is saying. Now they're not saying bad things, but they're getting it slightly wrong. I made a video about it. There had one featured columnist who did a thing and were promoting a model that not only wasn't appropriate. I mean, it was like the author of the model said, "This is just an intuitive thing. It's not the actual how engagement works," and yet they were promoting it as if it was. And so, you know,
Yeah.
I think there's a really important conversation to be had about education and psychology, as like the same way that medicine is
Mhm.
based on biology.
Yeah.
Okay, medicine's the practical stuff.
Hmm.
Biology is the basic science. Well, you need to understand that education is the applied science of psychology and the
Yeah.
psychology of learning and motivation and engagement. And so that's an important part of the book is
Yeah.
framing a model for that to have a better conversation about that.
Yeah, I love all of this because there's such a bigger impact that can be made on students and the educational systems by following an approach that what you're talking about. I'm curious
Right.
if we go back even a little bit further in time, because I want you to like really define holistic equity. Like
Okay.
what is your succinct version of that? Like I know like we're touching upon it, we're around it, we're orbiting it, but then beyond that, your website is holisticequity.org. So
Right. Right. Right.
when like how is holistic and equity kind of paired together? Because before you,
Right.
and we've done a lot of books in the DEI space,
Right.
a lot
Right.
of equity related work. I used to do consulting in this space, but yet I hadn't seen prior to you this idea of holistic and equity side by side. And I think
Right.
that's really fascinating. So can you just kind of share a little?
Right. So let's start with a really strong foundation. So let's start with the National Academies of Science in 2019, 2020 came up with a consensus definition of what they mean by equity. Okay, so it's really solid. And it was uh, hold on, actually I have it.
Love
I,
it.
I actually have made bookmarks to
That's
have have it easy. So their three-part definition was basically about distributing resources, about removing structural barriers, and then that needs have to be like it has to be attached to needs. Now they only mentioned needs once, and so I was like, okay, that's great. Consensus, people can all agree on this, but if you don't understand the role that needs play, then you've got a problem. And I went through a variety of publications on equity, and I've done this with not only the National Academy of Sciences work, but doing research for my website and things like that, really trying to delve into how are people talking about equity, what is it they mean by equity, and the reason I never used the term equity up until actually fairly recently was that I just didn't see what my work in that conversation.
Mm,
I saw that it was relevant, but I didn't see it like being brought out.
yeah.
And so I realized, oh, okay, this is where it is the um, both the left and the right, no matter where you are in the equity conversation, everybody's talking about how it matters for outcomes.
Hmm.
Now, okay, that's interesting, but the conversation breaks down if you put too much focus on outcomes, because what's happening is that the one side that's promoting equity is saying, yeah, this is diagnostic. We need to understand this and figure out where the inequities are.
Mm,
But then the other side says, oh, but then you're going to use that to create accountability, and if individuals are going to be judged on how they're meeting these criteria for
mhm.
outcomes and stuff like that. And both sides are right. If you were to go to that place and say, okay, we're only going to use outcomes as the accountability measure, you're creating crazy making
Mm,
stuff. You're like, you can't do that. That's not going to work. It's just it's not even logical. Anyway, you have to look at outcomes as diagnostic for groups, but if you're doing it on an individual basis, then you've got a problem.
yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, how do we resolve that? Um, so one of the things I suggest is that, okay, let's take that needs. And what I do is I reframe their consensus definition slightly. Um, I say, well, okay, distribute resources, but distribute resources to satisfy needs.
Mm-hmm.
I say remove structural barriers to need satisfaction, and then satisfy needs with parity across groups. Like, okay, we've got it
Yeah.
all there. But that the one piece that has to happen first before any of those,
Mm-hmm.
is you have to define your needs scientifically.
Yeah.
And that's where the work I've been doing actually gets into that very specifically. It's a framework called self-determination theory.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been, they back in the 70s posited this idea that, oh, wait a minute, maybe human beings have what they call basic, what I call primary psychological needs. Now,
Mm-hmm.
you know your needs for air, water, food, shelter, and
Yeah.
sleep. Well, the
Yeah.
first four, air, water, food, and shelter, you'll die if you don't get those needs met.
Yeah.
Okay. But the
Yeah.
fifth need, sleep, you don't die from a lack of sleep. Now, there are dysfunctions that will result that may then kill you, but
Yeah.
the lack of sleep will not in itself kill you.
Yeah.
So, what are the symptoms of a lack of sleep? More anxiety, more depression, more just psychological distress of various kinds. Well, it turns out they posited three other needs that are also psychological. Therefore, they don't kill you, but you get more anxiety, more depression, more distress.
Mm-hmm.
And those are for autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Mm.
And it's like, and so this is 50 years of solid scientific, well-respected research that says, yes, in fact, we have that. And they were just psychologists looking at motivation. That was their focus. And they did not set out to talk about learning. But they discovered in the process that those three psychological needs are fundamental to learning as well. And so when you have a school system that has also decades of research that show that the kids are disengaged, and not only kids, the teachers
Mm-hmm.
are disengaged at a rate of 70%, according to Gallup's data. And by the way, that's not actually an unusually high amount of disengagement. That's actually par for the course in the United States. 70% of the US workforce is disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
But disengagement is that piece where, okay, that's where if you're disengaged, you're not learning as deeply as you could.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean you're not learning anything, but you're certainly not learning as much as you could. And so I think the bigger problem in education is not the achievement gap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the engagement gap. And the engagement gap is far worse because I was somebody who was disengaged for many years in my schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And think of how much time I wasted being disengaged. I could have been learning so much more and better. I probably wouldn't have dropped out of college. I might not have even gone to college had I been engaged in following my passions. I might have.
Yeah.
As an adult, I found that doing this academic stuff is actually kind of fun. But it's an open question as to whether or not I would have gone directly into that, followed that path,
Mm-hmm.
had I been truly engaged in following the passions of my life
Mm-hmm.
when I was younger.
Yeah.
So that's the key right there. Is
Yeah.
holistic to me is I had to have a term to talk about equity to distinguish it from the regular everyday conversation in equity,
Yeah.
because I'm not focused on the kind of group outcomes that most people are focused on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do expect the outcomes to change.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is diagnostic and that's valuable.
Yeah.
However, I'm what needs to be the in-person accountability piece that the conservative side, the people who respond negatively to the equity conversation,
Yeah.
they're actually right in their criticism if they were to articulate it well. Often it's not articulated well, but
Yeah.
that's if they really got down to it, then we say, oh, okay, well, we need what would accountability for equity mean? And I think that's the place where my book is going a new place. Is it's
Yeah.
saying, hey, equity should be about, in order to be holistic, it has to take the whole person into account, and that whole person includes who are you? How are you in this world? And how do we support your autonomy, your competence, and your relatedness?
Yeah.
And that's going to be universal. Okay, it's going to help all kids
Mhm.
if you can do that better in your schools.
Yeah. It feels like you're really bridging the gap in this conversation in a lot of ways, where you're making kind of equity more digestible because you are looking
Yeah.
at it in a more holistic way, which I feel like is going to, like you're saying, is impacting all kids, which,
Right.
you
Right.
know, is a
Exactly.
fantastic outcome and based on science and psychology, which,
Right.
yeah, which really is what to me is kind of differentiating what this book is about and why this book is different. And it makes
Exactly.
me very excited for what the future holds.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you could, as we're kind of like nearing the end of our conversation, if you
Hmm.
could wave a magic wand and you have someone's read your book, in a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, whenever it is, and they feel a profound change
Hmm.
from having read this book, what do you think they would be saying to you?
So I think that there's two kinds of responses to that, I think, and that is there's going to be people who are kind of like I did, grew up in the system, and maybe we're training for that system and going into it, and saying, wow, I didn't realize how that, like, some of the stuff that was normalized is really not okay.
Hmm.
So that revelation of like, oh, okay, like I've literally had some teachers come to me after reading previous versions of aspects of the book and say, I didn't realize how much harm I was doing,
Mm,
which is sad in a way, and they feel bad. But my part of the reason I needed to, really pull a lot into this was in order to ensure that I'm not just saying that's bad, but I'm saying here's the path to something better, something that is morally satisfying and gratifying, and really builds like you can move in a new direction that is better.
yes.
And then the other one is I really want people who are familiar with some of the those schools on the edges that do operate, homeschooling, micro schools, various things, democratic schools. That's one most people don't know about.
Hmm.
Um, is someone in that world saying, "Oh yeah, this really makes sense of
Yeah.
what we do and how we do it, and gives us a new language to talk about it um, in a way that's helpful."
Yeah.
Um, and because one of the things is that they have conversations, and they'll use language that says, "Oh, that mainstream system's bad, and
Hmm.
our system's good." And funny thing, people who are called bad don't feel inclined to go and play in that playground, you know.
Well,
Um,
they wouldn't.
yeah, yeah. And so I think that using psychology as the kind of underlying that bridge or overlying, to help
Yeah.
span that gap between those ways of doing school,
Hmm.
will help that community and become, like, oh, okay, let's look at it and understand. And even the mainstream can be said, okay, when it works,
Yeah.
here's why it works. When it works, you
Hmm.
know, why do you, if you look at Hollywood and how they produce all these movies about amazing teachers, Aaron Gruel, who was uh, 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 oh, what was the name? I'll remember it in a moment. The writers movie, they
Oh,
Freedom Writers.
thank you.
Um,
Yes, that's the one.
so you look at, anyway, there's a whole bunch of them. The Ron Clark story, Freedom Writers,
Mm,
the one the Hispanic math teacher from the 80s. Anyway,
mm.
there's all these movies about these teachers
Dangerous
who,
Minds. That was
yeah,
one.
yeah, Dangerous Minds. That's another one.
Mhm.
Anyway, so you see all these movies, and the naive teacher comes in, and there's the cynical buddy teacher who helps them, and then there's the nasty principal. It's like all these tropes, and
Totally.
they play out. But the ones I've specified are ones based on a real life story. And
Yeah.
so what was going on? First of all, like, they usually distort the story a lot, because most of these teachers were not new. Some of them were, and then what they're doing is something that there's something going on, and we valorize these teachers,
Mhm.
um, but what is it they're doing? Is
Yeah.
it because they're charismatic? Like, if you look at Ron Clark and his stuff, I mean, he gets up and raps in front of his kids and gets his kids to do raps with him about the states or the presidents or all these things. Is it because he's charismatic? Or you look at a majority of them are actually female teachers, just which reflects the profession being largely female. Is it because they're feminine? Is it, like, what is it that
Yeah.
does it? And I think that what we need is this more science-based way of saying, oh, let's talk about what works and why it works. And it works because, and we
Mhm.
can look at underlying principles in the psychology of learning and motivation and engagement to say, oh, okay, this is why that's working. This is what Aaron Gruhl did in Los Angeles, and what Ron Clark did in New York, and now in Atlanta. He has his own academy in Atlanta now. And oh, I almost had his name, the one from the, anyway,
Yeah.
we can say why those things are, and we can look at other ones. Like there's this one principal from a high school in New Jersey where they had to basically make up a bunch of stuff. He's a real life person, but he
Mhm.
didn't accomplish the things that were portrayed in the movie about him. Where Morgan Freeman played him, and
Mhm.
it's like, why, if things were working in his school, why were they working and not working?
Yeah.
And we could actually say, oh, okay, that's why. He was being tough. He had a tough guy thing. He carried a baseball bat and actually locked kids into the school
Mhm.
against the fire marshal's orders, which is, he was both keeping kids in and keeping drug dealers out.
Yeah.
So on a surface level, a lot of people were like, oh yeah, got to be tough on those kids. And it's like, well, maybe.
Mhm.
But part of the consequence of his operational method was he ends up alienating a lot of people, alienating parents, alienating. Now, and then the real life story is he didn't actually accomplish what's portrayed in the movie.
Mm.
He didn't have a very good effect. And in fact, he went on he left the teaching profession and became got hired into the penal systems, the youth correctional facilities in the area, I believe. It's like, okay, that's telling.
Yeah, that's a lot. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I am just so excited that we are here, and it is today is the day.
Yeah.
So I have your website at the bottom of the screen.
Yes,
So if
very
people
good.
go check out holisticequity.org. Your book is available in all of the places. You're a nice Vanna White here.
Yes.
Schooling for Holistic Equity: How to Manage the Hidden Curriculum in K through 12. So if anyone is interested in that, I am a big fan, as is Publisher Purpose, of supporting independent local bookstores. So please, if you have the opportunity, if there's one in your area, just walk in and say, hey, I need to order Don's book. Boom, you can
Yep.
get it. If you don't have one in your area, bookshop.org is an online independent bookstore that does a ton of good in the community of authors and in the world of literature. So strongly encourage them as well. And of course, if you are used to just doing one-click purchasing via Amazon, the book is there as well. So
Absolutely.
whatever makes sense for you, but support local when possible. Don, is there any final parting words that you'd like to share before we conclude?
Well, I just want to, thank you for seeing me through this process and being a wonderful resource in taking next steps for my book, and really appreciate that, and encourage people to order it. Again, I'm available through my website. I'm just really excited to help serve and help people humanize their schools. So if there's any way I can help, I'm willing to do it. So.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate you, and we will talk soon. And for everyone else, I will be back with another launch interview at some point in the future. All right.
Great.
Bye, everyone.